Okay, you are.
Okay. Okay, everyone, welcome. Welcome to the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. This is our Power Not Paranoia webinars. We're on number 14, and we've been really pleased to be having plenty of conversation with the community, staying connected through all these different conditions that we are living under right now. We've got rebellion, we still have COVID, but we're hanging tight and we're building lots of power. So I really appreciate you joining us tonight and spending a few hours with us, having some really important conversation. My name is Jamie. I've been with the coalition for quite some time now. Before I get into our topic, I do want to do a little bit of housekeeping. So all of you all are on mute right now. We muted you as you come in just because, just to kind of keep the vibe going so that we can, we don't have too much background noise. But I'm sure folks have heard about the Zoom bombing, but we've made the whole space safe so that we still want to hear, what you have to say. You won't be able to chat in between each other, but you can chat to the host because unfortunately sometimes that is another avenue that people end up sending out, really unnecessary messages. So if you have a question, you have a comment, or you want to speak, just put your name in the chat. Put your name if you want to speak, or put your question, and myself and other folks that are facilitating will be able to hear your question. We are recording so that everybody knows, and this will be available later on the Stop LAPD Spying YouTube channel. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So today's webinar, we're really excited because, there's been a lot of conversation during our time of rebellion and folks on the street risking their lives. I'm a nurse, so I just send out all my love to everybody out on the front lines because I know that we're masked up and I know that we're staying safe. But, through all that, we know how important this time is right now, how important this time has been throughout our whole lives to really speak truth to power and to use our bodies and put ourselves on the front line to demand justice and change. So, and along with that, folks have been talking about, this idea of divestment and defunding law enforcement. The imagination is cracked open and the world is ready to receive, right? And so that has been amazing. And I think we are, riding another wave where so many of us can, latch onto each other and start really building that abolitionist movement that we are always been dreaming of. At the same time, we've been also having this conversation around investment and investing in our communities, taking money from police and putting them into systems that we know that we need, like housing and food and medical care, health care, community, green spaces, schools. And so what we want to do today is kind of crack that conversation open and really start, having a deep dive and an analysis of what that means. So before I get into introducing our panelists for today, which we have a great group of people that I'm really excited to hear their thoughts, I wanted to lay a little bit of the landscape that's been going on in LA. And we have folks here that are from different parts of the country, some folks who are local. So we've been talking a lot in LA and folks have been showing up at the budget hearings, really talking about defunding the police. But what we see LAPD doing essentially is shifting this this dialogue or this conversation, these demands into trainings, right? Into shifting monies, the little pittings that the mayor wanted to defund from LAPD of $150 million, actually trying to reinvest it in community policing in something called community safety partnership, which is essentially doing nothing about what we are calling for and why we are out in the streets. Today at the Police Commission, LAPD presented on, again, more monies and more programming for training in mental health training, implicit bias training, body-worn video. Even at one point, they were so ridiculous that they said they were hiring people from Stella Adler. And I don't know if folks know, down in Hollywood, that's a very famous acting school, where they were going to bring in these actors to, establish some kind of mental health crisis so that police could practice their interventions. And that was so humiliating and so, so pathetic to hear that that's how they're training themselves, through actors. It reminded me of a grant from the Urban Area Security Initiative, grant that is a federal government grant that goes into law enforcement, where at one point, different police departments were sending people to San Diego to practice intervening in a zombie apocalypse. So they actually funded actors to come in and pretend to be zombies, right? And so you hear these things and you wonder, where is this money coming from? What is going on? Our complete messaging they're trying to co-opt. So that is some of the landscape. And simultaneously we have, again, the people's budget that's being announced and being pushed, from Black Lives Matters, Los Angeles. And, so we want to have this conversation today to say, what is the people's budget, and how do we make that happen? How do we make sure that we build that autonomy in our communities, and what further analysis do we need to have, do we need to arm ourselves with, so that we're not just shifting money into the hands of the state? And so before I get into kind of talking about those intricacies, which I'm looking to the panelists to really talk about today and to share with us their knowledge in what are we divesting from and what are we investing in, I want to just turn it over to folks and introduce who we have talking with us today. So I wanted to first have Tawana Petty come on and let us know a little bit about themselves and share just a little bit about the work you're doing. So welcome, Tawana. Ahmed, can we unmute Tawana?
Yeah, Tawana, go ahead and unmute yourself. Go ahead, you're good.
Thank you. Good. Well, for me, it's good evening, everyone. It's after 9 p.m. here. So my name is Tawana Petty. I direct the Data Justice Program for Detroit Community Technology Project, as well as co-lead our data bodies, and I convene the Detroit Digital Justice Coalition. And my work focuses on digital equity, access, privacy, consent, and pushing back against the conflation between surveillance and safety.
Thank you, Tawana, for joining. I really appreciate you staying up this late night with us. Next, Alexis, do you mind sharing with us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hi, so I'm Alexis Takahashi, and I'm a member of Free Radicals, which is an activist collective, both here in LA, but also we have folks all over the country. And we are dedicated to trying to advocate for a more accountable, equitable, and just science. And we've been partnering with the coalition, and recently we won our campaign to dismantle Treadpool. So happy to be here and continue to dismantle the work of dismantling the police.
Thank you so much, Alexis, for joining. And Alexis, we're gonna miss her. She's gonna be taken off to the East Coast.
Yes, and a different beast to fight. NYPD's next.
All right, we'll take the tools and we'll stay in touch, most definitely. Next up, we have Cesia Dominguez. You're all the way down at the bottom of my screen, Cesia. I see you down there. You mind sharing a little bit?
Yes, hello everyone. Good evening, good afternoon. My name is Cesia, pronouns are she, her, hers, and today I'll be talking about our work with color coded. So as we're dismantling and are very clear about what we don't want, we're also exploring what do we want to see, what is the kind of world that we want to see and inhabit, and that takes imagination and it takes tools and creativity. So we've been exploring that in partnership with Stop LAPD Spying, and we'll be talking a little bit more about abolition tech today.
Great, thanks. And last but definitely not least, we are bringing on, we're shifting Hamid's position in these webinars from facilitator into participant mode. And so Hamid, do you want to share with folks a little bit about who you are?
Sure. Hey, everybody. My name is Hamid. I go by he, him. I'm with the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. Happy to be here and happy to be a part of this discussion, but also want to just lift just a sort of like deeper nuances that when we think of disinvest and reinvest, and we hear the conversations around social services, we hear the conversations around mental health, how are we really examining and investigating these institutions and these bodies themselves, because they very much form a part of the carceral state. They very much form a part of the Stalker State. So it's about like, how intentional are we in like jumping out of the fire into the or out of the frying pan into the fire kind of thing. So yeah, so really happy to have this conversation. Thank you, Jamie.
All right, thank you so much. So, so again, just to remind folks, the chat is open. It's open to the facilitator. So I really, really encourage people as you're listening, if questions come up, type them in the chat. And when it comes time for us to, throw our questions out there to our folks here, I'll go through the chat and definitely go up and down it and try to get everybody's questions. So please feel free to start putting them in whenever so you feel inspired, okay?
Jamie, can I just also announce that if people are on the phone and if they can't reach the chat, they can text their question as well to 562-230-4578. 562-230-4578. You can text a comment or question too. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Hamid. Okay, so first I wanted to invite Cesia to speak a little bit. Cesia definitely mentioned the embodied abolition work that we've been in partnership with for some time and actually helped lead to the dismantling of Operation Laser, which was a predictive policing program. In fact, we had an amazing public art demonstration in front of Community Safety Operations Center, which is like a data analytics center that was located in Central Division in Skid Row. We projected art, we pulled out the commander from inside the station, and we broke bread, we lit fires, and we spoke, and we were community. So I wanted to bring in that work, and having some conversation with Cesia, I wanted to talk a little bit about when we think about investing, when we think about embodying abolition, when we think about these things, what is our analysis and how are we analyzing power within these spaces? So Cesia, I really want to leave this kind of open-ended, but I definitely want to hear from you, where have you been in these conversations around divestment and investment?
Yeah, thank you, Jamie, for that. Yeah, I was just thinking about our time outside of CSOC, which is also located in Skid Row, where we were able to, we actually had fire to kind of give ritual and like transform some of the energy in the space. And the cops called the fire department on us. And then the fire department came and gave us the okay. So that was a really interesting moment for us as organizers and as folks who are holding the space, because it also just showed how disorganized the state is in showing up and caring for itself and its own institutions and its own departments. And yeah, so I think for us, what was important in that space is to really embody the world that we want to see, right? So if we know we don't want prisons, if we know we don't want police, like what is necessary? What do we need to cultivate? What do we need to feed? What do we need to nourish in order to build that world where we don't need prisons anymore, because that kind of violence maybe doesn't exist, or maybe it exists to that degree. So I think for us too, when we think about embodying abolition, we're thinking about systems of domination. So that goes beyond, you know, cops, institutions, the military. Yes, all of that is part of the prison industrial complex, but what are the other systems that keep people from living in their full bodies, right? And so like we think about gender binary. I'm a cis woman, and part of embodying abolition is really interrogating my cis privilege and how transphobia might show up in my body. I'm also a person that was shaped by borders and forced migration, right? So there's a lot of trauma that I might carry, that my ancestors might carry, that also shows up in the way that I show up in my organizing work, in my personal life, you know, in my community. And so when we're thinking about embodying abolition, we're really thinking about what are the systems that have shaped us. And because we haven't lived, none of us have lived outside of colonization, none of us have lived outside of capitalism, outside of patriarchy, outside of these nation states, it really takes, you know, radical, deep imagination and practice to really try to get to that, like what do we want to see instead, right? Because none of us have seen it necessarily before. So in our Embodying Abolition Build Mini World space, what has been really dope and exciting is that we've been using different art practices to kind of lean into that. So, you know, one thing as Latinos in LA, there's a lot of LAPD is Latinx folks, and a lot of us might have, you know, an uncle or a cousin that's in the military or wants to be a part of the police force. So how do we also have like preventative strategies to stop that from happening, right? So and one of the activities that we had was using teatro to practice being able to have those difficult conversations with our family members to pull them out of those systems, and using teatro because that allowed folks to kind of, and by teatro I mean theater, like playing it out, and it comes from a tradition of thinking about power and how you know, systems can shape us, and how we can also use embody and use our imagination in our bodies to also get access to embodying liberation, right? So we were using teatro to practice how do you talk to your family members, because sometimes when you're talking to your family members, I know that it took a really long time for me to not get heated and not get super excited and be like, no, you're wrong, or to actually just be able to listen to them and be compassionate about where they were coming from, and really meeting them where they're at, right? And for me to be able to do that, I really needed to practice regulating my emotions, regulating my my nervous system, to be able to have those conversations in a way that were transformative for my siblings, for my parents, but also for myself in that process. So yeah, I just really appreciate being able to kind of practice. That's what we're saying, that abolition is not a destination, it's not a deliverable, but it's a practice. And how do we practice embodying that and living into the different world that we want to see? Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Cecia. That was beautiful. Thank you so much. Yeah, that really reminds me of a conversation I was just recently having with my family as well. And it can be, the regulation of emotion is definitely something that can be very difficult, because these conversations are so personal. So I wanted to shift now to bringing in Tawana, something and building off a little bit of what Cecia also said as well. And Cecia mentioned the systems that have shaped us, and how those, you know, leave impact on us, and how when trying to undo these systems and have these conversations with folks, sometimes it takes a bit of discovering what these systems are as well. And one of the things that I found so amazing about the Our Data Bodies work was how knowledge of the surveillance state within the welfare, and then within the welfare state was actually discovered through story. So there was plenty of story and space that was held. And so I wanted to see if you could share a little with us, not only the breadth of your work, but what was discovered in these conversations that you had. And I believe there was 50 conversations in the 3 partnering cities with folks, and the systems that they were actually struggling through that were supposed to be the systems that were helping them.
Right, absolutely. One of the running themes that came out of Our Data Bodies research across LA, Charlotte, and Detroit was this sense that community members wanted to be seen, not watched. And they felt that these very systems that they were seeking support from or resources from were targeting them, were creating these data trails and streams of integrated data that was making determinations about their livelihood and their ability to meet their needs based on maybe what might be considered a minor mistake for someone that's not a person of color, or someone that's not poor, right? And so, or in poverty, excuse me. And so throughout all of our interviews, we were learning that, like, we're having these interviews in 3 different demographics. We're talking to unhoused folks, we're talking to folks of all different genders, we're talking to predominantly Black and brown folks, but some impoverished white folks, and it was just a consistent theme of feeling like systems communicate with with each other, and don't communicate with you. So they're communicating with each other, they're making decisions about you, but you're not able to access those systems for your benefit. And the targeting and surveillance that happens to each of these communities, once the system has deemed you not a viable human being, once it's deemed you expendable, was a repeat. You could literally blindfold yourself and ask these questions to any person across all 3 cities, and it was just the same thing. This looping cycle of injustice, you know, that you entered in and you just kind of stayed there. And so we, at the same time that actually that our data bodies was taking off the ground, in Detroit, a mass surveillance system was building up. So we have a system called Project Greenlight in Detroit, which is these green flashing lights that flash 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's kind of like a scarlet letter, where they, you know, put these flashing green lights in neighborhoods that they deem unsafe. And they're connected to real-time crime surveillance centers that are monitored by police 24 hours a day. And now they've added on a component of facial recognition. And so this was actually being built up the same time that we were doing the research with our database, and that was really heightening my awareness, because I was listening to all these community members saying, like, I just feel like I'm being watched. I feel like I'm being targeted, only to find out they were literally being watched and being targeted. And so our fight has been to resist facial recognition in the city and beyond, get rid of Project Greenlight. Right now, just in over 2 years, they've went from 8 or 9 cameras to over 700, including traffic lights, and the mayor is trying to push for 4,000. And so they use this surveillance system to target community members during COVID-19 for not social distancing. And so at the very same time that in suburban areas where you had folks protesting the state capitol with, or I won't even say protesting, you had white militia storming the Capitol building with assault weapons, demanding to get a haircut. They weren't getting tickets. They weren't being targeted for $1,000 tickets. They weren't being surveilled and watched. And so we understand, and I was looking at the previous presentation, we understand the surveillance system to be rooted in anti-Blackness, and the surveillance system to have like the connection to literally Project Greenlight mirrors the Lantern laws. Like, I know you all talk about that quite often, but it literally is the Lantern laws of having this flashing green light 24 hours a day to make sure that white people who move into the city feel safe. And so, yeah, so our data bodies was happening contemporaneously with that. At the same time, this knowledge of hearing from community members of being stalked and tracked and traced, and having these trails and streams prevent them from being able to make a living. These systems were being built up at the same time. And so I know I was all over the place. I hope I answered the question.
No, that's great. Tawana, do you mind just elaborating a little bit on what some of these systems were that community members felt that most of the stalking was happening, and what were they trying to access, or did the state say, we're going to give you? What were some of these systems?
Yeah, so I mean, any from basic food, you know, trying to get access to food, trying to get access to health services, trying to restore their credit, feeling like their credit bureau was just really keeping them in like I said, that looping cycle of injustice where you just are unable to make ends meet. Being a returning citizen and trying to reintegrate into society and find a place to live, or, you know, get a job. And so these systems were making these decisions. They had decided that you were not the human being that should be supported, and that you had whatever thing that they deemed a mistake that you had made, was to condemn you for the rest of your life, essentially. And so if your water was turned off, as an example, that water shut off will follow you. So it's not even like you could move and then like get water somewhere else. Like you were condemned to the mistake, the 15 seconds of a mistake that you might have made, or your inability to afford the resources that are supposed to be given to us as a human right, but you were consistently targeted. And these systems were making sure that they communicated your inabilities to one another, and creating like this cycle that prevented you and blocked you at every turn from being able to become a contributing human being. And so that was, it ran the gamut everywhere from, you know, being able to access water to housing to welfare system to education. And it literally it was across all three cities.
Well, that's very, you know, scary when you think about, you know, the fact that it's not just, you know, police that are watching us. It's not just police that are, you know, taking our resources. It's almost like the folks that are supposed to be providing us this resources have their own way of criminalizing us and taking actual resources and you know, punishing us. And finding ways to cut them out. So, so I want to definitely hold on to that as we shift a little bit to bringing Hamid into the conversation, because you spoke a bit about systems, how these systems communicate with each other. And how these systems, when they start communicating to each other, this is where they decide who gets access to what. And bringing you into this part of the conversation now, Hamid, it makes me think a little bit of what the coalition has been talking about in regards to the Stalker State. So I wanted to see if you can maybe elaborate a little bit on when we say the Stalker State, what do we mean by it? And what are the different avenues and channels when we think about policing, but when we think about all of policing?
Right. Thank you, Jamie, and thank you, Cesia and Tawana, for setting up that tone, because I think this is such a timely conversation to have, since there's such a call to action for reinvestment. But I think what is happening is that the way the whole broader system has been set up, it literally speaks to each other. And it's a system of mass criminalization. It's a system of mass suspicion. And it's a system that has been built, which is nothing new, like we always say, not a moment in time, but a continuation of history, that how certain communities within the broader control of white supremacy and capitalism and patriarchy and settler colonialism, that how communities are contained and controlled and criminalized. So what would that process be to keep, as well, they say, to keep communities in their place? So the information sharing environment is deep, and that's how people are constantly followed. I'll give you one quick example, or maybe a couple examples to show. So now this is a DMV chart, and this goes to show that how information moves when you go to the Department of Motor Vehicle. Now this was a very sort of a raw kind of an assessment that we did. We had a couple students and they did that. So anytime you go into DMV and you're looking for DMV services, your information immediately explodes into this ether zone. So in a sense, when, you know, and this also goes to the heart of a lot of, because we always say that our work in the coalition about surveillance is not about invasion of privacy, because from our vantage point, that's a very limited scope. And quite frankly, that's a very privileged space. And on top of that, a very white privileged space as well, because how many of our bodies, Black, brown, migrant, queer, trans, have had that, you know, that notion of privacy to begin with, because they have been publicly bared. They have been publicly criminalized. So in a sense, this is the process within the high-tech system of how we continue to be criminalized and how our bodies continue to be bared. So this is one example to bring. So now what happens after this information is gathered and then it goes into here? So when you're looking at it, so this is the broader information sharing environment of what we call the Stalker State. So the minute your information goes from the DMV, and this is not even scratching the surface. I just want to be very clear. And I want folks to think of this as a moving, it's not a static Venn diagram. Think of it as a multi-dimensional diagram that intersects with each other. So how information moves within various systems. So when we speak about reinvesting in social services, when we speak about reinvesting in housing, I think the question is, first of all, that what is a space are we walking in, and do we know our fight? You know, it's just, we always say, like, you know, in order to fight, we have to know our fight. And I'll give you one quick example and stop there. And this also comes through the Our Data Bodies project and our organizing in Skid Row, that there's a concept within for unhoused folks, and it's called the coordinated entry system. Now, that coordinated entry system is an intake that people will do of unhoused folks to find housing for them. So what happens, this is probably, and if folks haven't seen that, it actually just makes you very angry when you look at that intake form, because they ask you about your sexual habits. They ask you about, like, you know, I mean, to the, down to the, and I don't want to use foul language, so down to your knickers, basically, and even without that, they are, your body's bared, because they want every information on you, right? Now you have hundreds and thousands of people who are desperate. You have thousands of people who are giving this information. But on the back end, once all of that is done, there's nothing to provide with resources. There's no housing. There's none. So now what happens to that information? That goes to, not only have you just completely done an MRI on a person and datafied them into multiple, you know, data points, but you've also now basically, you know, just added more trauma to their lives, because you are announcing something that you can do that. So come give us your information, and then nothing happens. So I think I'll stop there by saying, and I'd love to hear other folks, you know, speak to this, that when we are talking about reinvestment, when we are talking about expanding resources, it is extremely, extremely critical to know that what is the landscape that we are walking in, because what's going to happen is that that reinvestment will circle back and turn around into, just exactly as you started, Jamie, into training the police. That's going to circle back and invest into the further criminalization of our communities, further processes of social control, further process of information sharing, that how people are being traced and tracked and constantly being monitored. So I just want to stop there with that.
Thank you, Hamid. So, you know, kind of walking through, or one thing I wanted to just make an announcement for folks that are joining. If you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. We are going to go through all these questions that you have. If you want to be unmuted to ask your question, we're going to shift now to Alexis, but I wanted to kind of bring together what this conversation is kind of saying. You know, when we were speaking with Cesia and really speaking about these systems that shape us, but seeing that these systems also that are shaping us are communicating with each other, and they're punishing us, and they're not allowing us access to resources that we need. And then as we take a deeper dive, we see that they're greatly connected to this larger stalker state that is, you know, in service to domestic law enforcement, federal law enforcement, that's in service to continuing the surveillance and the criminalization and the suspicion of our communities. So in saying that, I wanted to shift to Alexis, and I wanted to kind of poke at something just a little bit different to see if you could speak about, you know, how do we start to, because I'm kind of feeling like another round of questions that I want to come with you all again, because more of your work that I want to see. But I'm seeing, Alexis, if you can open up, how do we start to kind of integrate all this and fight back, and maybe speak a little bit about the algorithmic ecology? Seeing that so much of our fight now is really around kind of this datification of our lives, this automation of our lives. You know, Hamid spoke about the coordinated entry system, which was used essentially to gather data and to figure out who was most vulnerable and needed to have housing right away. But can you speak about how the algorithmic ecology really dispels any kind of utility of an algorithm in our lives?
Yeah, definitely. So I think that what the algorithmic ecology does, it shows all the different actors that come together to create these algorithms. So the lie that we're always told about algorithms and data is that somehow by getting a computer involved in the process, that we're somehow making it not racist, it's neutral, it's objective, and it is, you know, fair. And the LAPD even has this quote that we always like to mention about how it's not magic, it's math, and it's not racist. So what the algorithmic ecology really lays bare is that this algorithm isn't something that just like exists in the ether magically, somehow separate from humans and politics and society, but it's actually very deeply embedded in institutions of power, and it's a strategy from the interest of the ruling class to deploy these technologies on our community with very specific intentions, and that these are part of larger historical and ideological projects of settler colonialism, white supremacy, patriarchy, scientific objectivity, and capitalism. So this one that Hamid is showing here is the algorithmic ecology of predpols. So I think what you really see in a lot of analyses of algorithms and their impact is just kind of this analysis of this middle layer, which is the operational layer, where people talk about the data and the algorithm and how the data is biased, and that creates, you know, the LAPD is then going to over police our communities of color, and then that is going to kind of go back into the algorithm and just kind of like reinforce itself, which is definitely true and part of the story. But I think that what we needed to bring into this is that when we look at all of the actors that came together to make Predpol, we see we have, you know, Predpol Inc., which was created by Jeff Brantingham, who was a professor at UCLA, who got his funding from the Department of Defense, and that is very clearly like the academic military industrial complex at play, right? So we have the military, who's the largest funder of science, giving money to academics who then go and make these companies and profit off their work by selling it to law enforcement agencies. So there's a profit motive there, there's a militarization motive there. And then, you know, we look at this is a strategy of this like data-driven policing that's very much being spearheaded by Garcetti and City Hall, and also supported by the LA Police Commissioner meeting, or Police Commission. And that one of our commissioners on the, you know, on the panel is Sandra Figueroa Villa, who is, you know, also the executive director of these nonprofits, El Centro del Pueblo. And we have to start asking, why does Garcetti and LAPD and LAPC, why do they all want to have this program that criminalizes neighborhoods, that puts police officers in close contact with communities that are unhoused, that are majority Black, people who with disabilities, people who are trans and gender nonconforming? Like what is the interest there? And, you know, what we saw with Predpol was that that it was sort of creating this, when you look at the maps, is creating this boundary around Skid Row. And it was really on this like front line of where gentrification is happening, you know, where the boundaries of downtown have been kind of shifting to make way for more of these like high luxury apartments, apartment buildings, and kind of containing Skid Row residents into a smaller and smaller area. So the map that Hamid is showing now, you can sort of see that this sort of dense, this is basically a density map of a bunch of Predpol hotspots over time and where the hotspots were occurred the most. And you really see that there's this boundary that's happening along here that is it Main Street? I think it's Main Street or Los Angeles. It's Los Angeles Street, which is really this like battleground of gentrification. So we see that it is in the you know, local government's interest to, you know, with the support of their funding from developers and how they want their vision for the city, which, you know, doesn't include people like Skid Row residents in that, you know, imagination of what downtown LA is supposed to be. We see that Predpol is being used to kind of as a form of population control, to kind of push more and more people into a smaller and smaller Skid Row, and to kind of make it, you know, their lives are not as they're more disposable than the lives of the property owners in downtown. So I think that with the algorithmic ecology, it forces us to not just think about, it's not ever just about the police, right? There's a whole structure of institutions that come together that kind of collude to create these technologies, and that they have a broader agenda. And so when we are trying to dismantle an algorithm or, you know, a technology, it's not just about like, oh, let's just get rid of predpol, because this whole structure is still going to continue to exist, and it's going to always find another predpol or another technology to fill that gap and to continue to find ways to control our communities. But what we need to do is we have to actually dismantle this whole ecology if we want to get at the impact that it's creating at the bottom, right? So instead of having this algorithmic ecology that is built to create racist violence and harm, we need to kind of have a different imagining. So kind of think about what would instead it look like to have an abolitionist ecology, right? It wouldn't be this like really hierarchical structure where there are these institutions and ideologies of power at the top that are being operationalized to create community harm at the bottom. We would have like a much different imagination of what public safety looked like and what kind of communities we wanted to live in and what the structures of that would be.
Thank you, Alexis. Thank you so much. So, so this is really great. And I really want to encourage folks also to put comments into the chat if there's anything else that you want to add. Some things that I think are that the intent of bringing all these folks together was to really kind of start to demonstrate how and kind of open up this conversation on what are we really divesting from, when what we're divesting from also includes the social systems that we think are supposed to help us, right? Where the punitiveness we're seeing and the carcerality we're seeing in those systems, when we know that they're communicating to each other, when we know that they're creating an impact on our bodies that are, you know, shaping us and shaping how we engage with each other. And then also, I think I wanted to move into, so how do we start to break that open? How do we start to actually create a new world where we are living abolition, where we are embodying abolition? And is it as simple as just shifting of resources, or is there more things that we need to be thinking about? Are there other systems that we need to think about creating simultaneously? And is there a bigger fight that we have to get at? So I'm going to be looking at, I'm going to be kind of doing another round of questions, because what I'm not seeing too much in the chat, I just want to look up, make sure I'm not missing anybody. And like, again, I want to encourage folks to, you know, let us know what you're doing in your community. But I wanted to kind of go back to Cesia and in our embody abolition work. And I wanted to see if we could speak a little bit more about what Color Coded talks about when we speak about abolition tech. And when we talk about, you know, building other systems, and what would, you know, abolition tech look like, and what do we have to prepare ourselves to kind of have a new, and just as Alexis was kind of introing this, this kind of next set of questions, but what do we have to, you know, prepare ourselves for, and what do we have out there to prepare ourselves for? Is it just technology, or is it something different, or are we imagining technology as different?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. That's something that I've been thinking a lot about as we're having the conversation of, you know, care, not cages, you know, divest and invest. And I think like the question that keeps coming up for me is, what do we have that's worth investing in? What systems of care are actually designed to take care of all bodies, you know, not bodies that fit into the imagination of what the state deems valuable, which is usually, you know, cis, straight, wealthy men. And so I really appreciated Alexis bringing in kind of like some of the tenets that, because it's under science or it's under technology, you know, certain things are seen as objective, are seen as truth, right? And for us in Color Coded, I feel like a big intervention that we make is really thinking about technologies outside of a Western context. And so when we're thinking about carceral technologies, we're thinking about technologies that are well practiced in dominating hearts, bodies, and minds, right? And like that is the logic of colonization. That is the logic of what whiteness had to do in order to justify, you know, these were Christian European countries, and they had to dehumanize folks in order to justify slavery, in order to justify genocide, right? So it's so when we think of technology, we think of practice and systems. Like the use of technology is just using knowledge and intentional practice around a specific goal. And for us, a lot of what comes out of Western colonization ideology is this carceral logic, this carceral technologies. They're well practiced in domination, and there's certain, you know, stories that come with that. There's certain logic that comes with that we have to unpack, because they're seen as normal. They're seen as these are just the way things are, but they're actually really violent. So one of those old stories would be, for example, like in neuroscience, like the idea that your heart, there's a heart mind body divide, right? And now that we have MRI technologies, now that we have all these things, we see that no, you actually have a whole nervous system and a whole system that is talking to each other, right? And like one thing that really blew my mind was when I found out like Western medicine gained its knowledge by studying on bodies that had already passed, so on cadavers. So they were studying it basically by piece, and we see that happens a lot in Western logic, in these old stories, and how science likes to compartmentalize. I can't ever say that word. All these knowledges. So as a neuroscience, I had to take, you know, as an undergrad in neuroscience, so I had to take physics, I had to take biology, I had to take chemistry, I had to take all of these different classes, because that's how your system works. That's how your body works. It's a whole system that talks to each other. But the education system wasn't set up to, you know, foster that kind of holistic learning. And so we see like Chinese medicine or Ayurvedic medicine, they practiced and learned medicine through observing the body, through experience, through observing the whole system. And a lot of what we like to also highlight in color coded is stuff like abuelita technologies. Shout out to my friend La Loba Loca, who's an herbalist who does a lot to think about abuelita technologies. What side of technologies have always lived in our communities that just don't get seen as technologies, or don't get valued as technologies within a Western context? And for us, I think like the part of technology is really about rigor and practice. The same way that these systems, colonization has more than 500 years of rigor and practice to reinvent itself, right? And so instead of focusing on reinventing, instead of focusing on reform, how do we really question and go to the root of these systems, so that we're cultivating different kinds of worlds, different kinds of ideologies, of relating to each other. And yeah, and that it takes a lot of self-work. It takes thinking about your emotional bodies, your mental health, your spirit bodies, your collective bodies. Who are you in partnership with? The way that the folks have really brought out the architecture of surveillance. You know, the Stalker State is everywhere. So no matter where you are, no matter where you work, where you play, like there's ways for you to practice abolition, to practice and cultivate these different technologies. And yeah, and I'll stop there, I guess, for now. I don't know if that answered the question.
Yeah. Thank you, Cecia. Thank you. And so in thinking about all these areas and these spaces that we occupy and that we're in, I wanted to shift over to Tawana again. And in these conversations, Tawana, that we were having with different folks in these, 3 different cities through the Our Data Bodies project, and unpacking how people were surveilled through the welfare state and the different systems where we needed to access food, water, housing. I wanted to find out, as building on what Cecia was saying, how were people talking about fighting back? How were people talking about reimagining, a world without this surveillance? Because I'm sure in the conversations, people were figuring out, and there was a digital self-defense book that was created. So these conversations started to be had as to what other world do I want to create? How do I protect myself from this current situation that I'm in right now? So could you let us know a little bit of what was going on with those convos?
Yeah, so the irony in that is we elected not to put everything in the digital defense playbook because people were telling us how they were surviving the systems. And that was a level of resistance to the system of white supremacy, right? The system of white supremacy says your research needs to extract like a crap ton of data, and you need to be competing to be, you know, at the top of this academic hierarchy and all these other ways of validating research and information. And so, you know, there were instances where community members were telling us, you know, the ways that they've navigated the systems where we decided not to document it. But I will share some of the things that we did document. A perfect example is the water shutoff crisis, right? So community members realizing that, you know, I'm not going to be able to afford this water, but I need this water to live. My family needs water to live, and making a decision to turn their water back on. But the way that the carceral state, right, responds to something like that is to criminalize if you turn your water off. In Detroit, as an example, they made felonies out of turning your water back on, and then in some instances would show up to the house and pour concrete into the mechanism so that you could not restore your water. Another thing that they did was, speaking about the alternative systems that are being leveraged as an alternative to policing, social work as an example. One of the things that they also did was, if you turn your water off, they might take your children, you know, if they find out that you're in a home without water for 30 days. So then they consider your home being inhabitable. And so I'll talk about the resistance to some social workers exercise that I also talked to offline, which they hid files. They decided that they were not going to show up to these community members' homes and try to take these children. And so, so there was this kind of weaving of a network of folks who decided that they were going to resist these systems by, number one, not acting out the system that they're even employed in, and number two, residents navigating the system by making sure that water was turned on, water hoses being put through windows to make sure that kids are hydrated. You know, neighbors really turn into one another instead of against each other, and leaving it up to individuals to figure it out, right? And so one of the things that I've been doing over the last 3 years, actually, and I'll say this is highly contributed to the work with you all in our data bodies, and recognizing the impact that like social work has in this carceral system, is that I've been doing racial equity trainings with social workers specifically, because I understand that they are going to be the default when we start having these divestment conversations. People are going to automatically run over to them as being the alternative. They're going to take them in police rides. They're going to, you know, send them to people's homes. And we understand that Black and brown children, once they get into that system, oftentimes they don't come back out. You know, they don't get reunited with their families, and they're further abused within those systems. And so, you know, it's a reform at this point, but that is some of the ways that we've been engaging, is having these dialogues directly with schools of social work, directly with social workers, and connecting residents together to be thinking about how they show up for one another while we figure out how to dismantle these systems.
Yeah, thank you, Tawana. I think that part of what, you know, what I'm hoping that we're able to unpack in this conversation is kind of really these complexities that exist, but within the investment conversation, and really seeing that, you know, people have been thriving and surviving and figuring out how to, you know, get around them, how to protect themselves. And then people who are even within these systems knowing how to fight back, how to protect. I'm a nurse myself. There are plenty times that I've intervened just to protect my patients or people that were, you know, there for my care. And so I think as we start to realize, you know, the different systems we need to create when we are investing, we're going to have people that are rebelling, who are in these systems themselves, as well as realizing that we may not be able to fund these systems directly either because of how attached they are to the carceral state. So I wanted to kind of shift now to Hamid, and I wanted to kind of, again, dig into the divestment conversation and really kind of talk about, are we talking about all the divestment? Are we really seeing the full landscape of how much funding the police departments get? Are we really understanding and thinking that it only stops at city council? Like, is it really, you know, $3 billion that LAPD is getting, or somewhere around $3 billion? Or are we really kind of missing the other funding? And can you speak a little bit to needing to break open that conversation as well?
Right. Well, that's a whole lot of question there, Jamie, because it has several subparts to it too. I think when we look at the Los Angeles Police Department, and for that matter, many police departments around the country, you know, it's not only about the monies that they are coming from the city hall, but it's also a whole lot of money that they are getting from federal grants. Whole lot of money getting from the Urban Area Security Initiative, whole lot of money in LA getting from the LA Police Foundation, a whole bunch of resources and monies, which it may not directly be assigned a dollar figure, but there's a whole lot of support systems that they get. I mean, Dodgers are a major donor to the LAPD, major developers, Rick Caruso, who owns the Grove and various other projects, is a major donor. Steve Ballmer, who is the owner of Clippers, is a major donor. Even the president of the LA Police Foundation, Cindy I can't pronounce her last name, comes from a major real estate concern as well. So that's one piece that we need to be looking at. So secondly, as we are breaking open these budgets as well, I think what we also need to be looking at is like two things. One is that what is our argument? So in a sense, for example, right now the LAPD's liability runs into major pensions. So right now, this year's LAPD's liability is about $680 million of just paying pensions every year. And then in addition to that, $140 million of benefits that come along with the pension plan as well. So that's right here over $800 million. So now the question comes, like, you know, you're hiring more people. You want to hire 500 more people, which means you're going to pay them on an average about $70,000 a month. You're going to pay them on an average about $30,000 a year overtime, $70,000 a year plus $30,000 overtime. And also you're going to take on pension liability. So I think we need to be very methodically looking at that. What is our argument against not hiring more cops? You want it completely dismantled, but just putting it in a very narrow scope of dollars and cents as well, which that money can then be reinvested into the communities like youth development or various other things. But to be, again, very cautious that we're not letting the state dictate like what youth development would look like, because that by itself is very much driven by preventing youth from becoming gang members. So when that is a narrative, that you even go into working with the youth, that we are trying to and sort of dehumanize that point of contact to begin with, that it's based in GRID, gang reduction programs. Okay, well, what does that mean? So in a sense, so there's a lot of criminalization that starts from there as we move into these things. Section 8 vouchers. So I think that's when we are looking at disinvestment, there has to be a much more detailed conversation and breakdown down to the umpteenth level. And the last thing I would say is that there's a whole landscape of experiences that the immigrant community brings and other communities, particularly the Black communities, indigenous communities, of survivals outside of the system, where they have made the system irrelevant. And I think that's where the commodification of thought comes in the United States, because, you know, all of a sudden mutual aid has become really sexy and it is a huge thing that everybody's doing. Well, mutual aid people are surviving and aiding each other for the longest freaking time, you know, just like, you know, neighbor to neighbor, you know, just as family to family. That neighborhood survival that Tawana was talking about in Detroit, that's exactly a culture of mutual aid. So let's not sensationalize mutual aid, and let's make it more permanent in our lives as well. The whole notion of underground, it's called underground economy, but this is informal economy, where informal economies are not regulated. So for example, like, you know, childcare, and how families and communities provide that. And I'm not trying to romanticize these things, but what I'm trying to say is that there are tons and tons of examples, right, that surround us around us that where like, that these sort of things can be happening, where our journey towards abolition, not as a destination, but as one point as well, is really in the long run to make policing irrelevant in our lives. And if we are able to do that, and by that irrelevance, then we start looking at a whole lot of different things that can fill in that role, where it's not the policing of the state, but it's really amongst the community ourselves.
Thank you, Hamid. So I have one last question for Alexis, but actually I'm seeing that there's some movement in the chat, and there's one actually, Alexis, that I think, as building off of what Hamid is saying, and kind of thinking about reimagining how to build something new, how to plant the seeds to build something new. There is a question that's in the chat that I actually wanted to direct towards you, because it does deal with software engineers. And so Julia wrote a question that says, is there a role for software engineers to create algorithms that would help to liberate the community? Are there groups already organizing in the sphere that you trust? So what does, in this kind of recreation, can you speak a little bit about, when we think about science and we think about technology and we think about the history of that, since, free ride kind of comes in, and I've always appreciated how you've framed it as disillusioned scientists and, mathematicians and engineers, and, so what kind of role should they, should be there? And what role do they play in our liberation?
So I think one thing that actually you've said, Jamie, to quote you, is about some of the challenges of thinking about like, oh, well, like what's the right algorithm, is that what an algorithm does is it doesn't solve the root cause of the problem, which is about distribution of resources, right? So an algorithm might augment how we distribute the resources, or like say who's the most deserving or whatever, but it's not actually dismantling the systems that say that some people are deserving of resources and some aren't. So I think that's where I feel challenged in answering that question. But I think in terms of the role that scientists and technologists and engineers can play is by really looking at understanding the history of your field. And so I think, and kind of like undoing some of the mythology around science as being objective. So one thing that's really important that I think is part of our work that we do as free radicals is that we look at the whole history of like what we call colonial science. So recognizing that there are many different types of knowledge systems around the world, but the one that we know colloquially as like science is a specific type of knowledge system that came out of the West that was very much created in service of imperialism. And so because of that, like the logic of colonial science is very much one that is about like surveilling, being able to quantify and categorize people, land, resources for the purposes of controlling and extracting value from them. And oftentimes that meant at the expense of like Black and Indigenous peoples and bodies, and how do we control and extract value from them. So I think, when we look at policing technologies, which is about that same logic of like, how do we surveil people and communities and land and say, this is who's criminal, this is who's not who's criminal, and how do we control these different segments of the population, that isn't something that's a new logic in science, right? That is part of a longer history of like, even the creation of race was like part of a Western scientific project of saying that like certain types of people, because of where they're from or the color of their skin, are like biologically somehow different from other types of people, which that classification was a means to justify categorizing and controlling different types of people. When you look at our universities, most of them like Caltech, Cold Spring Harbor, Rockefeller, were literally founded by eugenicists who wanted to invest in biomedical sciences to get a better understanding of how, how white people are superior from other types of people. So I think the work of folks who care about justice and liberation and are trying to think about like how do you do that from your positionality as a scientist engineer, is really thinking about where do I work, and how is it maybe complicit in terms of the carceral system. So we're seeing some really interesting organizing happening at places like Facebook, Microsoft, these companies that have contracts and share data with the state, and how they're using their worker power to also disinvest from those carceral systems from, that vantage point. But also to make sure that whatever, if you're trying to think about like abolitionist technology, that it's something that you're doing in partnership with the community, that it's not something that, we see a lot of like saviorism in technology, that like someone's going to come in and create the widget that's going to like solve some social crisis. And that has never bared fruit as a strategy. We've seen many people make a lot of promises that, always ends up deepening inequality and controlling more power and resources in like big tech companies. So whatever work you're trying to do, it has to be led by the community, and that you are just really offering your services to what the community wants. So I know, for example, in the past, certain software engineers have worked with the coalition to help us understand and unpack these algorithms and their data structures, and how we can kind of understand them more on a technical level. But I would always first trust like who's just doing that abolition liberation work, and do your skills like have a place in that body of work? So I don't know if that answers the question, but it's definitely a process.
Thank you. And I think that's a lot of what we're starting to think about when we're thinking about creating a new world, what we're investing in. I want to move to some questions in the chat, and I see that Andrew P., I wanted to unmute you because there was one part of your question I wasn't quite sure, and I wanted to be sure it was, I stated it correctly. So is it okay? I'm going to unmute you. You can unmute yourself. I think I'm doing it correctly. Maybe Hamid, you can help me.
No, it's good.
Yeah, they're
Okay,
already
great.
Yeah. Hey, so I just had a question on like so the talk earlier, way earlier in the chat about like how stuff like the water system like collects your data and can hand it off to the police. Like it got me thinking about some experiences I've had with my family, and how like having to accept social services, there's a ton of paperwork there that asks for all kinds of personal information. I'm just wondering do we see any evidence like these means tested, social services like Medicare, and all the means testing systems put out in place of those, are they being used to help police bodies by asking for more data collection to better target and control populations?
So that's open to our folks on the panel, if anybody wants to.
Tawana, you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, I very much understand that we want to shift in a power not paranoia framework that I learned so well from the coalition, but you can pretty much assume that data is being extracted for that use. I mean, there's a long history of biometric surveillance and data extraction within the medical industry, and other systems that have been leveraged to, as was just being said, I think by Alexis, to socially control the undesirables. And there's no indication that the current system and the trajectory that we're moving in with the Stalker State and with mass surveillance, there's no indication that this country and the world, I might add, is moved away from that. And so, yeah, I would. It's safe to assume, unfortunately, that even with contact tracing and COVID-19, right? In Detroit, as a perfect example, the person who has the contact tracing app is the architect of our mass surveillance system in Detroit. So the billionaire who owns a lot of properties, who was the first to have the mass surveillance system, who was the Detroit Police Department was using his surveillance system before they purchased their own surveillance system, and he gets the contracts for contact tracing. And so this is a $1 trillion industry. Our data and our information is funding many billionaires and soon to be trillionaires lifestyles. And so that one of the hardest fights to get these systems to not collect so much data, to ask questions about why they're collecting so much data, to not share harmful information about us with other systems is we're fighting up against capitalism. We're fighting up against a dying capitalist system, which is fighting for its life, and holding on to whatever aspect of resources that they can tap into. And at this point, it's our biometric surveillance. And so that's why you're seeing so much innovation around gait detection, around emotion detection, around pretty much any type of way that they can tap into our livelihood, socially control us, monitor us, and relegate us based on whether they see us as viable human beings or not, and who can be contributory to continuing to feed into this system. And so, yeah, so I know that's a very long answer, but yeah, it's safe to assume that. And so whatever information you don't have to give, don't give it. And I would try to resist as much as possible, and until we can abolish these systems.
Just to quickly add, I just wanted to throw this chart up there. This goes into the Stalker State. So Andrew, this is just sort of a very rough bird's eye view of how information moves within the health and human services, what that information sharing is. Like I said, the more deeper nuances, the details, we can also look into that as well. But on many occasions, even the HIPAA protections are thrown out the window under the guise of national security, under the guise of investigations. So again, who's being criminalized, who is being targeted? And Tawana talked about, just the thought policing. So yeah, the telepathy surveillance has been going on for the last 15, 16 years, even when Microsoft even patented this whole thing around machine learning and artificial intelligence for telepathic surveillance that even to know what you may. So now it has taken on different shapes around behavioral surveillance and various other things. So definitely it is something for us to know and to be very aware of.
Thank you. We're getting some more in the chat, and I wanted to bring up another question. So where is that? Okay. This one is, I'm a graduate student in the humanities and care about these issues, but lack the technical background, for example, to teach a rigorous class on discriminatory algorithms. Wondering what folks without STEM backgrounds can do, especially in teaching positions. So if anybody wants to go at that one, we have about 15 more minutes and another question, and then I wanted to shift into a different conversation, but I'll say it one more time. So it says, sometimes I talk a lot. I'm a graduate student in the humanities and care about these issues, but lack the technical background to teach a rigorous class on discriminatory algorithms. Wondering what folks without STEM backgrounds can do in teaching positions.
Go ahead, Tawana. Unmute. Yeah.
Yeah, I try not to.
We can get Cesia too.
Yeah. If they're ready to speak, go ahead. I didn't see anyone chiming in. I don't.
So go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, okay, me.
Sorry.
Okay. Yeah. So I don't have a STEM background, and I'm intervening in these systems. So please don't think that that your voice is any less significant in staging interventions. One of the toolkits, and if Hamid, if you could share that out, that ODB consulted on and co-authored is with the Actionable Institute for Social Policy, is a toolkit on centering racial equity within data integration. And so this talks about not just how you can do community engagement, but some of the things that you have to be thinking about as these systems are being built out. And so I think that because we know that a lot of these systems are racially biased in their in their innovation, and a lot of these systems are communicating to the detriment of people of color, indigenous folks, even poor whites, is that we have to center racial equity. And so if you're doing any teaching within that regard, that's going to do a lot of, that's going to have a great deal of impact on how systems are innovated and how folks are educated about these technologies. Because one of the arguments that is pervasive within these data systems, technologists, you name it, folks who are debating whether it's an algorithm or is it cause or harm or whatever the debate is folks are talking about the different variations of bias. And a lot of folks are not talking about the impact that these systems have on the communities that they actually interact with. And so it's not about like what's created or whether the algorithm came first, what came last. It's about when that thing is innovated, who's going to be on the tail end of that. And there aren't enough people asking the questions in the beginning about whether or not this should be innovated in the first place. And so we need to have the questions in the beginning before there is this new thing unveiled or launched or thrown out into the community to then have us fight against it. So like we're all fighting against things because those questions are not being asked in the beginning.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, and I wanted to, yeah, perfect. I wanted to add to that also in the sense of I do have a STEM background, but the way that I think Color Coded talks about and approaches technology doesn't necessarily put us in a tech space or in spaces where we're sharing a lot of like space with tech or STEM majors. And I think for me, really what is at the core of the question then is what are the power dynamics at play, right? And as someone that is within institutions, how can you use access to redistribute some of those resources? Because these institutions have been part of, creating carceral technologies. And so at Color Coded, one way that we try to think about it is like having building respectful technologies, right? And what Tawana was saying is about asking those questions about, am I being honorable to myself, to my collective bodies, if I'm building this technology, if I'm building this idea, software, whatever it is, right? Maybe it's not your role to build that technology. Maybe it's not your role to teach that, but rather to redistribute those resources and redistribute the knowledge into the hands of folks that are actually impacted by these. I really appreciated Dean Spain really thinking about abolition is like, one of the things about, if we're practicing abolition is, are we mobilizing the folks that are most impacted by these systems so that they're also transformed and leading the work, right? And a lot of the abolition technologies that I'm most excited about are not known to nonprofits, are not known and are not being funded by these institutions because they don't get valued and appreciated and therefore funded and invested in the same way. And sometimes that's on purpose because we have a lot of these communities have had to protect themselves from institutions, from researchers coming in to these communities and end up causing more harm than good, right? And so I think for me, part of like the respectful technologies is like, what impact will also this have 7 generations down the line? A lot of technology, we forget that there's infrastructure, right? There's like underground cables that connect my internet so that I can communicate to folks across the ocean. And that's harmful. That's harmful to the ocean, to the bodies of ocean, to the bodies of land, to these infrastructures that have to be extracted from so that we can have access to these technologies, so that we can have access to these surveillance that the state needs to control and dominate certain bodies. So we call it respectful technologies too, because I think like the US isn't really ready to think about like decolonizing technologies. Like it just ends up becoming a buzzword, where in the US it's very identity politics based. A lot of the ways that sometimes, we think about intersectionality or think about abolition, it ends up being very identity and like, I am an abolitionist versus like, no, like I advocate for abolition, right? And like that's a shout out to Bell Hooks. Like she would be like, I advocate for feminism, not I am a feminist, because folks already have an idea of what feminism or abolition is or doesn't mean to them, as opposed to asking, when you say I advocate for abolition, and you're like, well, what does that mean? Like, what does that look like? And part of that, again, means asking those questions. Am I being respectful to myself, to my collective bodies? What impact will this have 7 generations down the line? And sometimes those, if we were asking those questions, these technologies wouldn't get built in the first place. And that's really interrupting to like the progress narrative that comes from the progress narrative that Western logic uses to justify capitalism, uses to justify extraction, uses to justify the harm and the violence that it keeps causing for the sake of progress.
And then there's a couple other comments, and then we're going to go and try to do what we do with unmuting and bringing everybody into this conversation. But before we do that, there was some other also additions to this conversation. Working on divestment campaigns on campus in relation to weapons manufacturers, corporations that sell data to the state, having students do research projects and presentations on variations of these issues. I think someone also said bringing in guest speakers, using university resources to host talks, hosting panels on surveillance and care and services. So folks were wanting to jump in on that, and I
There's
think
a couple comments on my side as well.
Great, thank you, Hamid.
Yeah, so what this is from, I believe Alejandro, just that I think one concern is around the alternatives to the prison industrial complex that we are building, and I'm assuming because it says PIC, and what parts of the local governance structures can be adapted, reshaped, and which are beyond saving. Similarly, and related to your point on real estate and commodification more broadly, how are we thinking through the elimination of the profit motive from all these structures? I would appreciate hearing from other folks who work in or are embedded in public sector spaces. Also, thank you for putting the whole series together. And one more comment that just showed up. Yeah, from Null is that I think it's particularly important that folks in the humanities play an important role that disproves all the assumptions that this technology is based off. Most of the data models and algorithms treat people as data points without truly weighing in class, race, social, and discriminatory practices that created the point for their data. So by reflecting true cultural and social impacts that reflect people's humanity leads as a proof that these algorithms, in fact, are predetermined to lead discriminatory results. So
I have one just short thing to add maybe, which is that I would argue that the people who know most about the algorithm are not like the Jeff Brantinghams of the world, but the people who are directly impacted. So if you want to understand like how policing technology works, I wouldn't say, yeah, go to UCLA and talk to some computer engineers. I would say go to Skid Row and talk to the folks living there, because they have an embodied knowledge of how those technologies work and how they're impacted by them. So, and you know, they don't have a STEM degree to be able to maybe like articulate the, you know, equations, but at some point that's almost besides the point. It's really what we're trying to dismantle is the impact. So that's always where we start our analysis from.
Mm-hmm. So before we open it up, and I really want to thank Tawana, Alexis, Cesia, and Hamid for really kind of being vulnerable and breaking down and not, you know, building paranoia in a sense, but building power in what we need to know, what we know already in regards to divestment and investing. Because if we're not having these difficult, complex conversations, we're not building the skill to maintain abolition. Because abolition doesn't just happen and then, you know, we're in abolition land and everything's going to be great from here on out. But it's a skill of communicating, of seeing, of analyzing, and of building and partnership that we have to be in constant motion and in constant practice. As Cecia was saying, it's something we have to embody. It's something, these systems have impacted our bodies. So we have to unlearn, we have to learn how they have, unlearn that and keep practicing. So I wanted to unmute, spend about 5 minutes just seeing if folks have any comments, any kind, and then if you can, mute yourself if you don't want to speak or if you have background noise. But I wanted to just open it up to see if folks, what is going on with divestment, investment in your minds, in your work, and feel free to kind of just let us know what you're doing as well. And this is how we try to bring back that community feeling of just being together and people start shouting out.
Don't be shy, y'all.
Don't worry, we got backup talking to do too, in case.
Yeah. I guess I could share that like a lot of libraries around town, both at UCLA and at the LA Public Library, there are huge pushes by the librarians and staff to defund the police and end relationships with the UCPD and LAPD respectively.
Wow.
Nice.
I think bouncing off of what Andrew said, yeah, like I think recently there's been a few petitions within like the UC system as a whole to do the same. Also, especially at UCLA after the whole like protesters being shoved into Jackie Robinson Field. But I'm not sure if the demands have said anything specifically around like technology yet. So I guess that's definitely something.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Maybe to follow up on that, I'm Olga. I work with Changes out of Los Angeles and Stockton, California. We have the privilege of having Alexis on our team as one of our managers. And, working with a young group of people between the ages of 11 to 25 years old, I think, and being exposed to this kind of conversation and really taking a stance as an organization against defunding the police, but also part of another coalition. Some of the work that our young people are doing is how do we bring a youth development department, but really now thinking about amplifying the voices of our Black siblings in our community and pushing that forward.
Any last thoughts or comments? Because we're going to be shifting here soon and actually having some more maybe community reading and discussion. But any other thoughts?
Go ahead, Dinah. Oops, sorry,
Okay,
sorry,
Mike.
Jim. Sorry, my bad.
Mike?
Yeah, Dinah was trying to. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Hi, Dina.
Hi, Dina.
Dina.
Wanted to say just having on divestment campaigns on campus specifically in the past, and like seeing there being a lack of connection with like surveillance tech, like corporate like divesting around Palestine and right now with the list of demands coming out and the organizers on campus that are working on these issues, to and have support coming from campuses working on similar issues, if that makes sense, would be valuable if it's not already.
Can you repeat just the last little bit that you were saying and maybe lean in a little bit more because you were breaking up and I couldn't tell if it was because other folks there was kind of background noise, but could you repeat just the last bit?
Yeah, sure. I guess just reaching out to the organizers of these campaigns right now, like working on the list of demands for like defunding the police specifically, and like incorporating, like not having community policing, incorporating like divesting from the prison industrial complex, incorporating Palestine, incorporating like these intersectional issues that all have to do with the same like beast. I think if that's not already being done actively, would be very valuable, given like the resources that students can access on university campuses and like the reach that students can have specifically.
Thank you. So I think there was Mike, and then I'm gonna just do the shift into, but the panelists don't run away because you're gonna get drawn into this next conversation too. But Mike, I wanted to go ahead and I saw you with your hand raised. Mike, can you unmute?
Yeah, and I'm also unmuting Pierre as well. So, and Mike is, sorry, Mike is, so maybe if you want to go with Pierre as I look for Mike, Jamie.
Okay. Okay.
Is that Mike Edie or?
Yeah.
Okay, there you go. Both are unmuted. So
Okay.
just hit unmute on your.
So would you like to for me to go first or for Mike?
Yeah, so Pierre and then so go ahead.
Okay. Well, thank you for the time and for holding space. I really appreciate it. Just I guess a bit of letting you all know some insight into how the movement is going on my end. I do work for the county on the County Commission on Human Relations. I think on a personal level, I've definitely been feeling this kind of sense of imposter syndrome, even just being within government, and just these feelings of wanting to be progressive and push the button and move everything forward. Then the powers that be always pushing against that, and the bureaucracy in that respect. And so I've definitely had my fair share of just like coming to terms with a lot of the power dynamics at play, but also still finding ways to really push and also organize outside of the space. We just released our policing report as well for the County Commission on Human Relations, and that's online as well on the website. The intent really here for me in not only just organizing on the grassroots level on my own through my own nonprofit, but also in remaining engaged, is to try to continue helping bring folks like yourselves who are really doing the work to the forefront of the conversations within government to inform it and build the bridges that need to be built. Because I do recognize that there's, in some way, shape, or form, that's a necessity. And yes, that's my position right now in the world. And so this conversation and this space is something that's extremely helpful. And I appreciate you all, because I not only really live this and embody everything you all are saying, but I also make sure to pass the information along to essentially the powers that be. So I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Mike.
Looks like we're having, I have some more questions on my end as well, Hamid. How about you?
I thought there was Mike there.
Oh, okay.
You said,
I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Couple quick comments. My name's Mike. I'm an immigration attorney out in San Francisco. Two of the larger organizations working on abolition up here. Of course, there's critical resistance, which I would imagine some people have heard of, which is in Oakland. And then in San Francisco, there's the No New SF Jail Coalition, which has recently had some success. Also, just a quick comment. Earlier, Jamie had mentioned something about, I think, public benefits. Maybe something to read about would be Trump administration's use of the receipt of public benefits to increase surveillance of people, and to also use that as an argument to deport them, depending on what kind of public benefits they've received. Also, in terms of generally just the algorithms, I'll say a year ago, it might have been more than that, I can't remember exactly how long it was, we found out that the Trump administration basically just changed without telling anybody the algorithm that was being used to determine whether or not someone would be released from custody and would wear an ankle bracelet. They just changed it. So basically everyone was determined to be an ankle bracelet. So, that's just a particularly horrible example of what can be done with an algorithm. And final comment, just sort of doing a little brainstorming in terms of possibly future organizing. If abolition maybe becomes an issue more at the state level, maybe this organization and something like the No New SF Jail Coalition and Critical Resistance could consider, working together a little bit, something like that. Just throwing that out there. That's all.
Yeah, and we've definitely have comrades up that we work to help dismantle the oh my goodness, I can't remember the big conferences that they have, Hamid, where they distribute all the different
Urban
webinars.
Shield.
Urban Shield, yeah. We did work with AROC, and I believe Critical Resistance was also part of that, and we took a trip up there and help them to dismantle that program. So definitely those connections are being made. And I have a couple more on my end that I'm just gonna read real quick, and then I do want to shift if that's okay with folks. How are folks feeling? Yeah, on your end, Hamid is.
Yeah, there's I don't see very much on this side.
Okay, so it says there was one from Adit that says, just a general question. We talked today mostly about state-run technologies. How does consumerization of surveillance, for example, Ring doorbell, fit into this? And then from Christina, last, it says, I'm interviewing for a senior institutional analyst position at a community college, and I'm trying to think of ways to work within the system to reduce harm. I hesitated to ask this because it's not really related to police, but it does use data to allocate resources. So it looks like we're kind of talking both outside of policing, one looking at kind of the private sector through Ring, but then also looking at, again, a public service in a community college. So does anybody want to speak to that? Any folks? Tawana? Let me see. Oh, do we need to unmute you? Okay, hold on one second. Let me get to that. There you are. Oh, sorry.
That's okay. The Ring situation, yeah, that's part of the equation here in our organizing. One thing that we've learned, not just here but in other places, is that that Ring is being given to officers to give to community members who are feeling unsafe, right? This conflation between surveillance and safety, where, they're offering up these Ring doorbells, and what is turned over to officers is access to that surveillance footage. And so it's bypassing a warrant, it's bypassing any protections that residents in that neighborhood or anyone visiting that home would have, to have their biometric data in their voice, and all forms of surveillance that happen with Ring doorbell. But yeah, so they're playing off of a legacy of fear, and offering this up as a mechanism for safety. And so these corporations have figured out these relationships. And, in addition to that, like the Project Greenlight program that I told you about, it's a public-private partnership. One of the first of its kind in the way that it's formed, where it is a combination of like the cable company and Guardian Alarm Company. So like an alarm company that's pretty well known, been around for a very long time, that residents are comfortable with. Like this is the place that has been securing their homes for decades. And so now they're partnering, and they have like this Ring access, and now it's a relationship with law enforcement. And so it's very difficult, especially in a city like mine that is 700,000 Black people, to get people to not feel like this is the way that we're supposed to be relegated and treated. And so it makes it very hard, even with residents sometimes, to convince them that surveillance is not the answer to safety, because of the narrative work that goes into creating the fear in the first place. And so this divestment and defund conversation is so important. This global conversation is so important because I feel like it has opened many doors for us to have an opportunity to have a dialogue about what it felt like before police was the first line of defense in our communities, before surveillance was the first line of defense in our communities. And so one of our counter campaigns is green chairs, not green lights. And so it's essentially asking people to come back to the front porches, to come back to the windows, to look out for one another, to not watch each other, to not stalk each other, to not report on each other and track each other, but to just actually see each other. And so if you want to prevent crime, you actually watch the kid walking to school versus hoping that your surveillance camera captured their kidnapping after the fact. You know what I'm saying? If you don't want people breaking into grocery stores and liquor stores for potato chips and food, you make sure that they're fed. And so just the very basics of going back to our culture and our practices, and restoring the village mentality and making sure that there is no least of these within our families in our neighborhoods. And so, yeah, so they're playing off of that fear and that disconnect, and they're offering up these tools to convince us that it's somehow creating safety in our neighborhoods.
Thank you. So, just one last comment. I'm going to unmute you, Cesia, and then we're going to transition. Let's see. Sorry, I lost you. Let me go move up.
I think
got it. Okay, great.
Yeah, and I think just wanting to add to what Tawana was saying, was really thinking about what are the power dynamics at play, right? Because at the end of the day, like who are the people who are running the corporations and who are the people who are in power, right? Like what we saw with, for example, the No Tech for ICE campaign, we saw that even though local cities had promised no collaboration between ICE and police, because Amazon has contracts with the federal government, right? There's now a backdoor entrance into all those data systems. And so really, like, who are these systems designed to protect, and who is seen as valuable and who isn't seen as valuable is really important to center. So for example, corporations have not, like, borders don't exist for corporations. And we have seen what those impacts are, especially after NAFTA in '94 and what that happens, right? But borders have existed for people, for humans. And so really what interests are being protected, and who has the power to say, these are the bodies that need protected. These are the bodies that have, human entities that have human dignity established to them, and who gets to decide that, right? Who gets to design that? Who gets to implement those into things? So really, I hope that folks, like, really encouraging, like, what are the power dynamics at play, because this private public isn't helping us, and really putting it back into the power of communities. We have our communities know how to take care of each other. Like Tawana was saying, like, there's a reason why the youth is showing up late to school. There's maybe stuff that's going on at home. Maybe they're dealing with mental health issues. Maybe they're working because they have to help their family pay their rent, and that's the reason that they're not showing up. They're not showing up in school. So all that to say, like, in the same, the state operationalizes us to exert power on each other, right? And so, like, that's how teachers and social workers then end up having to sometimes enforce some of these power dynamics. So when we're thinking about solutions, when we're thinking about, for example, like the people's budget, right? Like, when we're thinking about it, what is the long-term goal, the long-term vision there, right? If this election cycle, these politicians are on our side, but that doesn't guarantee that the next election cycle, those folks are there. So we need strong communities where the choices of where that money goes isn't just a one-time this budget, but really, like, putting the power and autonomy back into the hands of the people outside of the state and outside of the institutions. And there's lots of examples to this too, where that is currently happening right now as well. So just want to upload them.
Thank you, and that's a great note to end on. So I want to thank everybody for this conversation, and I'm going to quickly, because we definitely dove in, and definitely folks got invigorated and started sharing, so I really appreciate that. but I'm going to pass to my colleague Shakir, and we're going to have just kind of, again, like kind of building on what Cecia is saying, a community conversation about some analysis, old analysis that the coalition has had. So Shakir, you want to take us through that?
Sure, yeah. Hi, everyone. So, yeah, what we're going to be talking about, I think, is very much building on this conversation and thinking about, you know, at the same time, even just what Cecia was saying now, at the same time that we're seeing some politicians maybe kind of willing to join with us or at least like move a couple inches on kind of decarceration and defunding, this moment also means that there's going to be a lot of reformers and reformist organizations also trying to take advantage of the kind of power that mass movements are building now to pass changes and pass reforms that will overall serve to kind of strengthen the surveillance state and perpetuate kind of the same.
They were saying on Twitter. Yeah.
Perpetuate the same ideas that perpetuate like the idea that it's the state and it's the police who can kind of govern themselves rather than our communities who will always hold them accountable and always build power outside of the state. So we have, this is, we kind of have developed, we developed like a statement about the laws that basically, that some jurisdictions have started passing that regulate surveillance or create kind of transparency and other kind of requirements for what surveillance systems need to have. And our position in the coalition has always been that these kinds of ordinances, even though they're passed under the idea that they're going to restrict surveillance or be requirements on them, actually over time kind of facilitate surveillance and put trust in the police and the state to regulate surveillance rather than putting power in our communities to dismantle these systems. So this is a statement that we started drafting a couple months ago. And we're hoping to roll it out actually really soon because of this legislation is starting to pop up around the country. So this is it. And I think we wanted to do kind of a community read through of it and then see if people have feedback. So people's mics are unmuted so we can kind of just do a paragraph by paragraph. But yeah, so the title we have, how many of you scroll up? Well, right now, the title we have is Fuck the Police, Trust the People, Surveillance Bureaucracy Expands the Stalker State. We're still workshopping that title and whether whether to start with Fuck the Police or move it later or not have it or whatever. So want to hear feedback on that. But yeah, I think let's start by just doing a read through, I think paragraph by paragraph. So if anyone wants to take that first paragraph, Stop LAP Spying Coalition, and just jump in and then we can continue like that. We don't want to call on people, but we can.
I can help. I'll start. So and I'll do the first paragraph. Actually, is it okay if I read the quotes? I think their quotes are really powerful.
Yeah.
So surveillance is nothing new to Black folks. It is the fact of anti-Blackness. Simone Brown from Dark Matters. We will never have a complete definition of fascism because it is in constant motion, showing a new face to fit any particular set of problems that arise to threaten the predominance of the traditionalist, capitalist ruling class. But if one were forced for the sake of clarity to define it in a word simple enough for all to understand, that word would be reform. George Jackson, Blood in My Eye. Stop LAPD Spying Coalition is a volunteer-run grassroots organization rooted in the Skid Row community on stolen Tongva territory, also called Los Angeles. For almost a decade, we have been building power to dismantle LAPD surveillance to fight for a world without policing and mass criminalization. Throughout that struggle, we have organized not only against the police who cast deadly suspicion on our communities, but also against police reformers who affirm that suspicion by entrusting the state to regulate surveillance as though our people cannot be trusted to know, name, and dismantle what oppresses them.
Gary, do you want to read? I thought you were.
Okay. That second word I'll probably trip over. Surveillance bureaucratization is the latest trend of that legal reformers are embracing to help the state legitimate Policing. Reformers always exploit moments of mass insurgency to make state violence more expansive and more durable. We saw this with the body-worn camera surveillance that reformers used the Ferguson uprising to force onto our communities. It's happening again. We call upon communities across the country to reject surveillance, you know what I mean, and join us in building grassroots power to abolish the surveillance state.
So I'm not sure if people are able to unmute, so you might need to chat if you can't.
Did we unmute everybody?
I figured out the word bureaucratization, I think.
Yes.
So we got 8 minutes.
Do you want to help with the next paragraph, Hamid?
Okay, where is surveillance bureaucracy coming from? Campaigns to push this reform have always been led by legal nonprofits that depend on access to elite power brokers to sustain their work. The campaign Stop LAPD Spying has the most history resisting has been led by the ACLU, which works especially closely with law enforcement to plan reforms. In 2015, we exposed that the ACLU's local director of police practices shared a draft of their model surveillance ordinance to an LAPD deputy chief, asking, in quotes, if you have any concerns with any of the provisions that are in here, end quote, and inviting ideas for, quote, provisions you think that should be in here but aren't, end quote. The ACLU, in partnership with other reformist groups and legal organizations in 2017, worked with municipal prosecutors and a city council member to advance a similar local law. Stop LAPD Spying and other community groups confronted the groups pushing this ordinance and forced them to withdraw it.
I think the problem is, Hamid, the screen is showing up black on some people's end, so people are not actually able to see the image.
Well, I can't help that, so I don't know.
No, I'm just letting you know, that's all. I'm not,
Sure.
That's saying that's why maybe people aren't volunteering. They might not be able to see it.
Gotcha, gotcha. Okay. Well, maybe we should read it out to folks, if people, whoever can see it.
Yeah.
I'll continue. A similar fight later unfolded with SB 1186, which would have empowered local authorities across California to streamline the expansion of surveillance technologies. Stop LAPD Spying led opposition to this bill. Groups led by the ACLU joined politicians to celebrate how the bill would mean a seat at the table and public debate to create community assent in surveillance. We mobilized communities across California to defeat the bill. We hope that history is a warning that legal reformers will face fierce resistance from our communities if they try to enact laws legitimating surveillance of our people.
In the time since we opposed SB 1186, similar fights have unfolded across the country. In many other communities, the resources and access of legal nonprofits have won the day. Most recently, New York City this month enacted the Post Act, a law that we believe empowers police to write self-governance policies and claim their violence is legitimate by public input. With mass movements taking to the streets to oppose police violence, politicians who were responsible for $1 billion increase to NYPD's budget needed good press, and legal reformers helped hand them that win. The full text of the Post Act can be read here, and we encourage people to read it.
We highlight that last example because we worry that COVID-19 and the national uprising will be used to force similarly backwards reforms across the country. Politicians and lawyers joined hands to celebrate the Post Act as a tremendous and vital victory. But the truth is this is the easiest possible win in this moment, and it betrays the bolder visions of the mass movement forming on our streets. Our people are facing downright police and political prosecutions to demand that policing is defunded, dismantled, and abolished. No one is marching for police self-auditing and impact policies. Yet the state will be quick to offer surveillance bureaucratization as a hedge against those demands. Abolitionists need only to fight for the changes we want, but resist the ones we don't. In order to do that, our people must be organized and educated, and we must plan to win.
What is surveillance bureaucratization? There are many different approaches to it, but the overall notion is transparency. Police are tasked with making public some information about the surveillance they're using. With those requirements set, the regulations create a framework for public approval of that surveillance.
The exact details of how surveillance is approved vary. In our view, a police-controlled process can be just as harmful as one that promises community control. New York City's Post Act falls in the first category with an approval process that takes NYPD or tasks NYPD with writing surveillance impact and use policies that tell people what police think the impact of surveillance will be on them, and also what policies police plan to follow. NYPD then posts the policies on their websites where the public has 45 days to comment. The police are asked to consider comments, though no one has power to force any changes or explanation. NYPD also never has to share how they came to their conclusion. The underlying information remains secret as ever, and the public only sees what the police concluded, which will no doubt be carefully framed by the NYPD armies of lawyers.
Other models, like those we defeated in California and the one the ACLU is currently pushing in Washington, D.C., feature a broader input process that includes public hearings and an approval vote. But this just deepens the same problem. It takes power away from the people and directs opposition into a process that marginalizes community voices while elevating voices that support police or at most compromise with them. And at the end of the day, the legislation lets police say that the community controls policing. Community control is sometimes even in the title of these laws, when the truth is that police set the agenda and hold the power. After securing public approval, the police unleash their violence with a claim of legitimacy and public input.
Surveillance is the tip of policing's knife, and it has always been an instrument of racial control. Police reform is crucial to the evolution of racial domination and settler colonialism. The feature of policing that we face today was once reform. Police reform is inherently anti-Black because its goal is improving an institution that has been white supremacist at the very moment of its history. Modern surveillance's origins are slave patrols, lantern laws, forcing Black people to illuminate their bodies for surveillance and control, indigenous extermination, infiltration of community organizers, and enforcement of apartheid.
Can we unmute Olga?
Yeah. Okay, I'm so sorry. I don't know how to do to this one, so my bad.
We can just unmute everybody. Okay, I
yeah.
did it, Olga.
Go ahead. Yeah, unmute all.
Okay, you want to put up the statement again?
Oh, shoots. Yeah, sorry.
It's okay. This is great. I'm really appreciating it.
Okay, so we start with the as abolitionists, this paragraph.
As abolitionists, we believe that reforming oppressive systems is always dangerous, but surveillance bureaucracy is an especially wrong strategy because it gambles liberation on the same regulatory framework that has made policing so oppressive, hoping for different results this time around. Decades of transparency legislation, civilian oversight, and self-auditing have done nothing to reduce the power and violence of the carceral state. Instead, they helped create a vast punishment bureaucracy that lends political legitimacy and social inertia to mass caging and police violence. It is absurd to hope that applying the same framework to the governance of surveillance technology will do anything other than expand the reach and harm of policing, much like how these reforms have long made the carceral state bigger, harsher, more durable, and racist as ever.
The 5 basic premises of surveillance bureaucracy are fully flawed, and they betray everything abolitionists must fight for as we build autonomy and safety beyond policing. 1. Surveillance bureaucracy trusts police to self-audit and self-govern, when we know that police can never be trusted and that laws facilitating the use of police technology will be used to establish new oppression. 2. Surveillance bureaucracy pretends that police violence is not transparent, as though it is not in our faces, on our necks, and piercing our flesh, as though surveillance is somehow separate from the rest of policing, and as though our community cannot be trusted to ourselves, name the impact of the oppression we face. 3. Surveillance bureaucracy trusts that the concerns of those most harmed by surveillance will be well understood and represented by police and politicians, when all these people have ever done is excuse and expand state violence. 4. Surveillance bureaucracy pretends policing can be reduced with new rules and criteria, when we know this just leads to police to invest more resources and personnel into monitoring and avoiding compliance. 5. Surveillance bureaucracy presumes the community wants to be surveilled, so long as the state follows a heavily stacked process, pretends to consider input, and checks off a few baseline legal requirements.
Those ideas are the reformist thinking that created the oppression we are trying to dismantle today. We know that our daily organizing work, that our people do not want to be surveilled either illegally or legally. At a time when mass uprisings have made that view widespread, we should use that power to abolish components of the surveillance state. We should enact bans on surveillance of faces, of association, of movement, of expression, of youth. This would actually help dismantle policing. Surveillance bureaucratization goes in the opposite direction, giving the state a footing to defend itself and stake out more durable positions.
A useful comparison here is our experience with community advisory boards, in which the state empowers people and organizes and organizations who they trust to work with them. As we know from our experience with the Los Angeles Police Commission, a civilian body that oversees the LAPD's chief in operations, institutions like this do not represent the community as a whole as much as they represent a narrow segment that benefits either. Hamid, can you bring it down? Directly or adjacently from the police state. Even when the representatives are elected by or from the community, they still tend to be accountable to the people who are most harmed by surveillance. These institutions just redistribute power among our oppressors. They share nothing with the autonomy and self-determination that abolitionists have been fighting to build for centuries.
There is a better way to resist surveillance, building grassroots power to resist and systemically dismantle state oppression. Unlike the pro-carceral heritage of reforms that trust police to govern themselves, this is a struggle that entrusts power in the hands of the people. The heritage of our resistance includes the struggles to liberate people from colonialism, enslavement, and capitalism. This is a journey of decolonization, divesting from police and investing in the autonomy that the state has denied our communities.
This is the last page, by the way.
Here in Los Angeles, our success against LAPD surveillance has been growing. Just in the past year, we forced police to dismantle their laser and chronic offender programs, both ended in 2019, as well as PredPol ended this April, all using grassroots advocacy and direct action. We also worked to ground LAPD's drone program for years and have challenged LAPD's reliance on UCLA scholars and infrastructure. And we are currently developing campaigns to take on more forms of state surveillance and policing.
Through much of our history resisting surveillance in Los Angeles, wealthy legal nonprofits have fought on the opposite side of the struggle. For example, the coalition last year exposed the Vera Institute's role helping the U.S. Department of Justice to legitimize the LAPD's laser program. When we fought to dismantle laser, police pointed to the joint paper that DOJ and Vera put out together promoting laser. With Vera expanding its influence on the campaign to end cash bail in Los Angeles, we urge that the movement for pretrial reform and the dismantling of the police state must reject allegiances with entities like Vera that use the rhetoric of liberation but have a long history of serving the carceral state.
The example of the ACLU may be worse. As noted above, the ACLU drafted a surveillance ordinance with input from LAPD. The ACLU's Director of Police Practices attorney promised LAPD to work towards enacting a set of rules like these that will ensure use of surveillance technology is consistent with the principles we've discussed that I think we agree on, end quote. In contrast to this close camaraderie, sharing of principles, and collaboration with the LAPD, the ACLU never sought input from communities harmed by surveillance or those working to build power among this population. Instead, grassroots groups and community organizers are only asked after the fact to sign on to the ACLU's proposal and to mobilize their constituents in favor of it. This is how legal nonprofits use the community time and again as cover for collusion with police. Given into this model is playing to lose. Giving into this model is playing to lose.
Proponents of surveillance bureaucratization might say grassroots work like ours is not politically expedient. We believe these people are on the opposite side of our struggle to delegitimize and end surveillance. It is easy to claim political success by passing legislation that doesn't actually challenge police power. In fact, nothing could be easier or more dangerous. At moments like now, when the masses are feeling their power to make bold demands, reform endangers us by diverting energy from more promising fights and by creating structures that police use to empower themselves. Abolition is politically inexpedient only if legal reformers succeed in making it so. Our agenda is unrealistic only if we do not struggle for it. When reformists tell us our goals are unrealistic, what they're often saying is that they intend to stand in the way, just as they always have.
Last paragraph.
Liberation requires imagination, and it requires courage. Our journey to ensure our future, embody abolition, and end policing is rooted as much in historical analysis as it is in the truths we see around us every day. Police are hunting our communities, tear gassing our children, and killing our kin. Our fight is against both police and anyone else who works to empower and legitimate domination of our people. And while we will not shy from naming the police states consorts, we do not aim to divide those fighting for liberation. We invite organizers to unite in teaching each other, reimagining what is possible, and building grassroots power to end surveillance. We are eager to join together to know our power and to know our fight. Awesome.
So yeah, that's it. I don't know, Jamie, what, yeah, I mean, it's past 8, so.
So yeah, so it's past 8, and so if folks feel like hanging out for 3 minutes or 2 minutes, or anybody has some immediate, comments that they want to make, we do intend to release this statement tomorrow. It's not something new. It's something that we did in 2014 when ACLU developed the model ordinance, Making Smart Decisions About Surveillance. We came out, just as we stated in the statement, with an analysis against these kinds of ordinances. So we are basically just restating it in the response to what happened in New York, because we definitely want to fight this in LA. So does anybody have any immediate, and I know if folks are tired, please feel free to jump off. We're the coalition, we talk forever.
Go ahead, Tawana. Unmute.
I'm just gonna, as I exit, because it's after 11 here. We're forced into that right now. We've been working on a community input over government surveillance ordinance, basically because it's our only option at this point. We're in a really Black city where everybody feels like we need to be surveilled, and we've been unsuccessful in fighting off facial recognition, and mass surveillance is rapidly expanding. And so we're kind of forced to use that as a stepping stool to get community in the room. And that's the only reason. Going in knowing that ordinance is insufficient, and that being forced into that position is something that we're going to have to abolish the infrastructures that would allow for that to happen, where we feel like that's our only option at this point. So I'm really grateful to the coalition for taking such strong stands, and for modeling how you go like all out against these systems and entities and organizations. And I look at you all as a leader in this work, and we'll continue to stand on your shoulders and follow your lead. So thank you so much for including me. I'm gonna fade away in front of y'all if I don't get off right now. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Tawana. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
It was a pleasure
Appreciate
having you.
y'all.
Thank you.
You too. You too. Bye.
So, so just so folks know, Mike, I see you. We are going to be having a webinar next Tuesday to further go into the statement as well. So, Mike, you were going to say something?
Yeah, just 2 comments. First of all, I really love what you're saying about the ACLU. Just from my own personal experience, when I was a public defender in New York, I was getting so many people, I was representing so many people who were, getting beat up by cops. I approached the ACLU to try to help me brainstorm and figure out something, and they wouldn't touch it. At some point in the piece that we were reading, I want to say it was around halfway, there was a sentence that said, I think it used gamble liberation. And I kind of tripped up a little on that sentence and just the use of the word gamble. I wasn't quite sure. I understand what it means generally, but I just tripped up on that phrase. So that's my only comment.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay.
Okay, so.
Are we going to say something? I was going to just say, are we going to say something about the title? Are people okay with "fuck the police" and trust the people? Because it's going to be up going public tomorrow, and we'll say that,
giving thumbs up.
from Alexis to Audrey to Shakir to Cesia, Francis, everybody signed on, and Mike absolutely is going to distribute copies of this by "fuck the police, trust the people." No, I'm just kidding. So,
Tiffany's giving a thumbs up over here. Tip's giving a thumbs up.
awesome. Okay.
Where is it going to be made available? Or in what form? On social media or on your?
All of, right,
okay.
Jamie? Shakir?
Yeah, social media, on our website, right?
Yeah, we're gonna design it as like we're kind of designing it now as it'll just be a PDF that will be emailing out and circulating online, and someday hopefully printing out copies and being able to distribute them, but for now online.
All right.
All right. So I think we'd had a power session today. This is how the coalition rolls. And I really, really appreciate everybody hanging in there and helping us read that statement. I love joint readings. They make me very happy. They make me feel very connected to folks. So I appreciate everyone that was listening and everybody that was reading. So I want to thank Alexis and again, Tawana and Cesia and Hamid for joining and talking about divestment and investment and helping us have this really complicated conversation. I appreciate everybody that was on this call, hanging in there, all us late nighters, revolutionaries into the morning light. And that's it. So thank you again very much. And join us next Tuesday. We will be thoroughly going through this statement and what we mean by surveillance bureaucratization. Good night.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.